The arrogant new producer had no clue I privately owned the entire studio complex. "Your contract is terminated, and security is removing your gear," he scoffed, not glancing up from his mixing board. I handed over my key card with a calm smile, already anticipating how catastrophic his VIP listening party was going to be tonight. My uncle, Silas Hensley, bought the building on East Lafayette back in October of 1994. It was an abandoned auto parts warehouse with exposed brick, rotting rafters, and 3 inches of standing water in the basement. Everyone in Detroit told him he was out of his mind, but Silas had an ear for acoustics that bordered on freakish. He spent 2 years clearing out rust, floating concrete floors on rubber isolators, and lining the walls with dense rock wool and reclaimed barnwood. He named it Sound Sanctuary, though around the city, people just called it the Lafayette. By the time I was 12, I was spending my weekends sitting on milk crates behind the recording consoles. Silas taught me how to align the heads on an analog tape machine before I learned how to drive a car. He taught me how to listen to a room, how the flutter echo off a bare wall could ruin a vocal track, and how a properly placed baffle could turn a muddy bass line into pure thunder. When Silas passed away 6 years ago, he left the entire property to a family trust. I was the sole trustee and silent owner. I didn't want my name on the building, and I didn't want to run the administrative side. I just wanted to do what I was good at, sitting in the dark with a soldering iron, calibrating vintage gear, and engineering records for people who actually cared about the sound. Then, 6 months ago, our oversight board brought in Blaine Trask. Blaine showed up in a custom leather jacket, driving a leased European sports car, talking about synergy, monetization, and brand elevation. The board thought we were lagging behind modern commercial studios. They thought Blaine was the man to bring in high-paying pop clients and corporate ad work. I agreed to step back, keep my mouth shut, and stick to my title as senior acoustics engineer. I figured I'd let the man run the business while I kept the rooms sounding clean. It took Blaine less than 2 weeks to start ripping the soul out of the place. His first target was the B Room, a warm tracking space where local indie bands, jazz trios, and gospel choirs had cut records for 20 years. It wasn't our biggest moneymaker, but it paid the electricity bills and kept the local scene alive. Blaine walked in on a Monday morning, canceled 3 months of booked sessions for a dozen local groups, and locked the doors. He announced the B Room was being converted into a private VIP lounge for his high-profile pop friends, complete with LED light strips, crushed velvet sofas, and a bar stocked with top-shelf liquor. I stood in the hallway and watched him tell a young indie group who had saved up for 6 months to record their debut album that their time wasn't valuable enough for his studio. The lead singer looked like he'd been punched in the gut. I almost stepped in right then, but I stopped myself. I needed Blaine to build a case against himself so thick that even the board couldn't defend him. By week 3, Blaine was liquidating our history. I walked into the microphone locker one morning to find 3 vintage Neumann U47s missing from their velvet cases. Those mics had been hand-tuned by Silas in the 90s. They were priceless. When I confronted Blaine in the corridor, he didn't even stop walking. He told me he'd sold them off to a private collector in Los Angeles to cover the cost of the marble countertops in his new executive office. By month 5, he turned his sights on the people. Clara Farrow had been our resident session cellist for 19 years. She had played on gold records and local union demos alike, bringing a rich, terrifyingly precise tone to every project she touched. Blaine fired her over a 2-line email sent at 11:30 on a Sunday night. The email claimed her acoustic instrumentation was outdated for current market trends. When Clara came in on Monday to collect her sheet music, she was crying so hard she couldn't fit her key into her locker. I helped her pack her bags, carried her cello to her car, and told her to hang tight. "Just give it a little time, Clara," I told her quietly as she wiped her eyes. "This isn't going to last." She looked at me like I was lying to make her feel better. I wasn't. The final straw came on a gray, freezing Thursday morning at 11:15 a.m. Blaine summoned me into the main control room. He was sitting in the high-backed leather chair behind the SSL 4000G console. The board Silas and I had rebuilt wire by wire over 6 months back in 2012. Blaine had his feet propped up on the mahogany armrest, scrolling through his phone. He didn't look up when I walked in. He just slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was a notice of termination, redundant staff position. It offered me 4 weeks of severance pay on the condition that I signed a broad non-disclosure agreement prohibiting me from discussing studio operations or gear liquidations with anyone in the industry. "You're an artifact, man," Blaine said, his eyes still glued to his phone screen as he adjusted his diamond stud earring. "We're streamlining. We don't need a guy making 70 grand a year just to fix cables and clean tape heads. Security will escort you out if you're not off the property by noon." I looked at the paper. I looked at his polished designer sneakers resting on the custom wood frame Silas had sanded by hand. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I took the pen from his desk, signed the document using a deliberate, loose scrawl, and handed over my master keycard. "Good luck with the listening party tonight, Blaine," I said. He let out a short, dismissive laugh. "We're going to pull in $15 million in label backing tonight, Chief. We don't need luck." I picked up my canvas jacket, walked out the back door into the rainy alley, and climbed into my truck. The rain was pounding against the roof like gravel. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and dialed Julian Farrow, Clara's brother, who also happened to be one of the sharpest intellectual property and contract attorneys in Chicago. "Is the ironclad protocol clear to go?" I asked when Julian answered. Julian chuckled on the other end of the line. "It's been clear since 2008. Leo Silas wrote that trust agreement like a fortress. The moment management breaches the core artistic integrity clauses or terminates key legacy personnel without trust approval, the management operating lease automatically dissolves. The master deed reverts to you instantly. Every piece of signal processing gear, every server, and every master recording made on those grounds becomes locked under your sole custody." "He just terminated me," I said, "and he fired Clara 3 weeks ago." "Say no more," Julian said. "I'm hopping on a noon train out of Union Station. I'll meet you in the alley behind Lafayette at 7. I spent the next 6 hours sitting in a coffee shop 3 blocks away, pulling up the digital paper trail. I had spent months quietly monitoring the studio's internal servers. Blaine thought he was being clever, but he was sloppy. He had racked up $3.2 million in unauthorized construction debts by taking out predatory loans against the studio's future revenue. He had tanked our local indie bookings by 40%, alienated 4 major regional record labels who used us for legacy remastering, and paid out-of-state contractors under the table to build out his VIP lounge. He hadn't built a modern music empire. He had gutted a neighborhood institution to build a playground for his own vanity. At 8 p.m., the rain eased into a heavy, cold fog. I parked my truck around the corner from the studio. The alley was lined with luxury SUVs, stretch limos, and blacked-out sedans. Blaine had spared no expense. Valet drivers in black coats were running back and forth. Inside, through the frosted glass windows of the main tracking room, I could see the flashing purple and blue lights of his newly renovated lounge. Bass was thumping through the walls. A heavy, compressed pop pop track that sounded like every other song playing on Top 40 radio. At 8:40 p.m., Julian Farrow pulled up in a taxi. He was wearing a dark wool overcoat and carrying a leather briefcase. Walking behind him were two uniform enforcement officers, off-duty deputies hired through the county sheriff's department to serve formal court-stamped civil injunctions. Ready to take your house back? Julian asked. Let's go, I said. We walked through the side entry, the heavy steel door I had painted black when I was 15 years old. The hallway was crowded with catering staff carrying trays of champagne flutes and mini sliders. We pushed past them into the main tracking room. The space was packed. There were at least 80 people in the room, record executives in tailored suits, music bloggers with cameras, streaming reps, and local investors holding crystal glasses. Blaine was standing on a riser near the center console, holding a wireless microphone. I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight, Blaine was saying, his voice echoing through the PA system. What you're about to hear tonight isn't just an album, it's the new standard for sound. We've built an engine here that is going to dominate the charts for the next decade. He reached out his hand toward the computer terminal, preparing to hit the spacebar to play his flagship artist's lead single. I wouldn't touch that spacebar, Blaine, I called out, stepping through the center of the crowd. The room went quiet. People turned around, looking confused. Blaine froze, his hand hovering over the keyboard. When he recognized me, his face flushed a deep, ugly red. What the hell are you doing here? Blaine snapped into the microphone, his voice sharp over the speakers. I fired you 5 hours ago. Security. Two large security guards in black polo shirts stepped forward from the edges of the room. Before they could take 2 steps toward me, Julian Farrow stepped into the light, holding up a high-visibility badge and a thick stack of legal documents. The 2 sheriff's deputies stepped up beside him, their arms folded, looking impassive. Keep your hands where they are, Julian announced, his voice carrying easily across the high-ceilinged room. My name is Julian Farrow. I represent the Silas Hensley Master Revocable Trust, which holds the exclusive title and deed to this entire property. Blaine scoffed, trying to laugh it off for the crowd. Is this a joke? I run this studio. My management company holds a 20-year master lease on this facility. You held a lease, Julian corrected calmly, pulling a document from his briefcase and stepping up to the mixing console. He slapped the paper directly over Blaine's track sheet. Under Clause 14B of the original 1994 property agreement, commonly known as the Integrity Trust, the tenant's operational lease is contingent upon maintaining the studio's historical structure, legacy staff, and core equipment assets. Over the last 6 months, you have illegally liquidated historical hardware, terminated protected legacy engineers without trust consent, and converted primary recording zones into unauthorized commercial entertainment space. Blaine stared at the document on the board, his jaw tightening. That's total bullshit. My legal team reviewed every contract before I took this job. Your legal team reviewed the management agreement, Julian replied smoothly. They didn't review the property deed. The management group you work for doesn't own this building. They were tenants. And as of 8:42 p.m. tonight, due to multiple material breaches of the trust agreement, that tenancy has been formally revoked. A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd of executives and investors. I saw 2 men in expensive gray suits near the back exchange glances and slowly set their champagne glasses down on a speaker cabinet. Furthermore, Julian continued, turning to face the room, under the intellectual property provisions governing the hardware and power routing in this facility, all master files recorded or processed on these premises during the period of lease violation are subject to an immediate legal freeze. Nothing leaves this room. No files, no hard drives, no audio stems. You can't do this. Blaine yelled, dropping the microphone onto the console with a loud metallic clatter that echoed through the monitors. I have $15 million in funding sitting in this room right now. We are 10 seconds away from playing the single. You're free to play whatever you like in your apartment, Blaine, I said, stepping up to the console beside him. But as of right now, you are trespassing on private property. Every piece of equipment in this room, including the board you're leaning on, is locked down. I reached past him, flipped the master circuit breaker switch on the rack behind the console, and the entire studio went dead. The ambient blue lights killed instantly. The monitors hissed and went dark. The only light left in the room came from the emergency exit signs casting a dull red glow across the stunned faces of 80 music industry professionals. For 5 seconds, nobody said a word. Then, the back door opened, and people started leaving, first in pairs, then in groups. The executives Blaine had spent 3 months courting didn't bother to say goodbye. They pulled their coats on, looked at the deputies standing by the door, and walked out into the rain. Within 10 minutes, the grand listening party was down to 3 people, me, Julian, and Blaine, who was standing in the dark next to a dead console, sweating through his custom leather jacket. Get your personal belongings, Julian told him, quietly. The deputies will escort you to your car. If you return to the premises without a court order, you will be arrested for commercial trespass. Blaine looked at me. The smugness was completely gone, replaced by a hollow, desperate fury. You destroyed a $15 million deal, you redneck idiot. He spat through his teeth. You think you won? You just killed this studio. You can't run a place like this on local garage bands. My uncle ran it for 24 years, I said, leaning against the cold frame of the board. And we never had to sell our soul to pay the power bill. Get out. The deputies escorted Blaine out the back door. I stood in the dark, silent tracking room for a long time, listening to the rain hit the roof. It was the first time in 6 months the building felt clean. The next morning at 7 o'clock a.m., I was back at the studio with a locksmith. We spent 3 hours changing every lock on the exterior doors, reprogramming the digital keypads, and wiping Blaine's access codes from the security system. By noon, I was sitting at the front desk with a landline phone and a yellow legal pad. My first call was to Clara Farrow. Clara, I said when she answered, how fast can you get down to Lafayette with your cello? There was a long pause on the line. Leo, what happened? Blaine's gone, I said. The B room is getting rewired this afternoon. We have an indie folk band coming in on Monday, and they need a strings track. You interested? I could hear her let out a ragged, shaky breath over the line. I'll be there in 20 minutes. My second call was to Marcus Locke, a drummer who had played on half the records cut in Detroit between 1998 and 2018. Blaine had banned him from the building 3 months ago for refusing to use a digital drum pad during a live session. Marcus, I said, bring your kit. We're ripping out the white leather couches in the B room. I'll bring a sledgehammer, Marcus replied. By Saturday evening, the studio felt alive again. Marcus, Clara, and 2 other former session players were sitting around the kitchen counter in the back break room, eating cold pizza and drinking cheap coffee out of chipped mugs. We had dragged the velvet couches out to the dumpster and were in the middle of reconnecting the copper snake cables to the B room patch bay when the mail carrier knocked on the glass front door. It was 4:30 p.m. The mail had already been delivered that morning, so I was surprised to see him standing there in his blue uniform, holding a small brown padded envelope. This came through express mail, Leo, the carrier said, handing it to me. No return address, just delivered to the street address with your name on it. I thanked him, took the envelope back to the main desk, and slit the top open with an X-Acto knife. Inside was a single black metallic external external hard drive. It was heavily worn around the edges, the rubber bumpers scuffed from travel. Taped to the front of the drive was a small, white piece of masking tape with a name written on it in black permanent marker. Timothy C. Vance. I stared at the tape for a moment. I had never heard the name Timothy Vance in my life. I plugged the drive into my laptop on the desk, opened the file manager, and waited for the volume to mount. A single partition appeared on the screen, titled simply LFA_recovery. I clicked into the drive. Inside was a single folder containing hundreds of subfolders, organized by date, stretching back over 3 years. Every folder was filled with unreleased stems, raw vocal tracks, multi-track studio sessions, and private financial ledgers. I opened the first financial document. It was a PDF titled Trask_Vance_liability_agreement. I scanned down the first page, and my stomach dropped. Blaine Trask wasn't just an arrogant producer who had failed upward in the music industry. Blaine Trask didn't exist. His legal name was Timothy Vance. 3 years ago, he had been the minority manager of a high-end recording facility in Nashville that had gone under after $4 million in client royalty funds went missing from their escrow accounts. He had changed his name, moved north, and taken the job at Sound Sanctuary under a forged resume, backed by an out-of-state holding company called Winter Management LLC. But it wasn't the fake name that made my blood go cold. It was the list of assets attached to the back of the agreement. Winter Management LLC didn't just employ Blaine. They were a commercial development firm based out of Chicago that specialized in buying up distressed industrial properties in urban centers, intentionally running the existing businesses into insolvency, and then foreclosing on the land to redevelop the lots into high-density luxury apartments. Blaine hadn't been hired to modernize Sound Sanctuary. He hadn't even been hired to turn a profit. He had been hired by our own oversight board's majority investor, a man named Dorian Trask, who happened to be Blaine's older brother, to systematically destroy the studio's operational revenue, rack up unpayable debts, and trigger a forced bankruptcy sale of the Lafayette warehouse property. My uncle's ironclad protocol had stopped Blaine from executing the final phase of the plan, but it hadn't cleared the debt. I opened the financial ledger folder on the drive. Sitting right at the top was a demand letter dated 4 days prior from a private mezzanine lender in New York. They were holding $3.2 million in defaulted high-interest loans that Blaine had signed using the studio's operating entity as collateral. Because I had terminated the lease and taken back the property, those loans didn't just vanish. The lender had already filed a pre-foreclosure lien against the physical building on East Lafayette. I sat alone at the desk, looking out through the glass window at the dark tracking room. The old brick walls, the custom oak baffles Silas had sanded by hand, the isolated concrete floors, it was all sitting under a $3.2 million execution order that was scheduled to mature in less than 30 days. My phone rang on the desk. The caller ID showed an unlisted number with a Chicago area code. I picked up the receiver. Leo Hensley. A man's voice came through the line. Quiet, smooth, controlled, not Blaine's loud, frantic voice, but someone older. "Hello, Leo," the man said. "My name is Dorian Wynn. I believe you recently came into possession of my brother's hard drive." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. "Your brother calls himself Blaine, and the drive says his real name is Timothy Vance." A brief, dry laugh came through the speaker. Timothy always had a flair for the dramatic. He played his part well, even if he let his ego get in the way of the timeline. But the outcome remains the same. "Leo, your uncle's trust may own the bricks, but my company owns the paper hanging over them. $3.2 million, maturing on the 24th of next month. He had no legal authority to sign loans against the physical asset," I said, keeping my voice flat. "He had corporate authority to bind the operating entity," Dorian replied calmly. "And in the state of Michigan, an operating entity's cross-collateralization attaches to the leasehold property unless paid in full upon lease termination. You locked him out on Thursday night, Leo. That accelerated the debt. The full balance is due immediately. You built a fraudulent paper trail to force a land grab," I said. "Call it whatever you like," Dorian said. "The court looks at signatures, not sentimentality. That warehouse sits on 3 acres of prime Lafayette real estate. It's worth $6 million to my redevelopers. To you, it's just an old building that loses money on local folk singers. We're not selling," I said. "You don't have a choice," Dorian said. "Unless you have $3.2 million sitting in a drawer somewhere, you're going to lose that building at a sheriff's auction before the end of the month. Or, we can make this simple. You sign over the property deed to Winter Management by Friday. We extinguish the debt, we pay you $200,000 for your trouble, and you walk away cleanly." I looked out at the B-room doorway. Marcus was sitting on an empty amplifier case, holding a roll of copper tape, laughing with Clara while she tuned her cello. "I'll see you in court, Dorian," I said. "Court takes money, Leo," Dorian said softly. "You have 26 days. The line went dead. I hung up the phone and sat in the quiet desk chair for a long time. The winter rain started tapping against the front window again, cold and steady. I didn't tell Marcus or Clara. I didn't tell the rest of the guys in the back. I just closed the laptop, locked the drive in the heavy iron safe under the desk, and walked back out into the tracking room to help them finish wiring the B-room. On Monday morning, the indie band arrived at 8 a.m. They were 4 kids from Ypsilanti, driving a beat-up van held together by rust and duct tape. They brought in worn-out amplifiers, a battered drum kit, and 3 cases of cheap soda. They were nervous, stepping around the main tracking room like they were walking through a cathedral. "We only have enough money for 4 days of tracking, man," the lead singer told me, pulling a crumpled envelope of cash out of his coat pocket. "We want to make sure we don't waste your time." I looked at the envelope. There was maybe $1,200 in it. "Put your money away," I told him, setting his guitar case down near the microphone stand. "We'll worry about the bill when the record sounds right. Let me go set up the drum mics." I spent the next 3 days living in the control room. I slept on the worn tweed sofa in the back office, woke up at 6 every morning, and spent 16 hours a day dialing in tones, adjusting mic positions, and writing the faders on the Cecil board. Clara came in on Tuesday afternoon and tracked a cello arrangement for their 3rd track that made the band's 18-year-old rhythm guitarist sit down on the floor and put his head in his hands because he couldn't believe how good his song sounded. It was the best work we had done in that building in 10 years. But every night, when the kids left and the lights were killed, I sat at the front desk with a calculator and a yellow pad, trying to figure out how to raise $3.2 million in 22 days. The trust had maybe $40,000 in liquid reserves, just enough to cover property taxes and insurance for the quarter. My personal savings were non-existent. Everything I made went back into buying replacement vacuum tubes and maintaining the vintage consoles. Julian Farrow was working 16 hours a day in Chicago, filing motions to stay the foreclosure lien, but he was clear with me. Michigan commercial real estate law favored the lien holder when cross-collateralization signatures were involved, fraudulent intent or not. "We can drag it out in court for 6 months, Leo," Julian told me over the phone on Thursday night. "But the legal fees will eat us alive, and eventually, a judge is going to order an escrow bond to hold the foreclosure. You'd have to put up 20% of the debt just to keep the building while while we litigate. That's $640,000 in cash. I don't have 600 grand, Julian, I said. Then we need leverage, Julian said. Something that makes Dorian Wynn decide that holding that debt is more expensive than dropping it. I thought about the black metallic hard drive sitting in the iron safe under my desk. What about the stems on Vance's drive? I asked. There are unreleased sessions on here from 4 major label pop artists. Tracks Vance cut in Nashville and LA, using stolen studio time before he came here. Julian was silent for a moment. If those tracks are unreleased, who holds the underlying copyrights? The artists and their labels, I said. And if Vance cut those tracks illegally using commercial gear owned by Winter Management subsidiary entities, Winter is sitting on a mountain of direct copyright infringement liabilities. Can you prove he used Winter's money and hardware to track them? Julian asked. The metadata is stamped into every file, I said. Every audio block has the serial number of the interface, the date, and the digital signature of the console system. It's all right here. Don't touch those files, Julian said sharply. Don't copy them, don't play them for anyone, and don't send them over email. I'm taking the morning train back to Detroit tomorrow. We're going to do this face to face. Friday morning was bitterly cold. A skim of black ice covered Lafayette Avenue, and the wind off the river carried the smell of wet soot and frozen lake water. Julian arrived at 10:00 am carrying 2 heavy leather accordion files. We locked ourselves in the back office behind the main control room, pulled the drive out of the safe, and hooked it up to an isolated workstation that had no connection to the internet. For 4 hours, Julian went through the digital paper trail while I cross-referenced the audio metadata. What we found was worse than a simple real estate scam. Timothy Vance, Blaine, hadn't just been running a land grab operation for his brother's development company. He had been running a high-end bootleg engine. He was taking unreleased vocal stems from top-tier artists who recorded at studios where he worked, stripping out the original instrumentals and selling the raw vocal tracks to ghost producers overseas for $50,000 a pop. The money from those sales wasn't going into Winter Management's bank accounts. It was being routed directly into a private personal account in the Cayman Islands, held under Vance's real name. Dorian Wynn didn't know about it. Dorian thought his younger brother was just a slick, ruthless operative helping him clear out an old warehouse for a real estate deal. He had no idea that Timothy was setting up Winter Management to take the fall from multi-million-dollar federal copyright infringement lawsuits from 3 of the largest record labels in the world. This changes things, Julian said, leaning back in his chair and rubbing his eyes. Dorian isn't a crook who steals music. He's a legitimate real estate developer who uses aggressive corporate tactics to acquire land. If he finds out his brother has exposed his core development company to $10 or $20 million in federal statutory damages, he'll choke him with his bare hands. So we show Dorian what his brother was doing, I said. We don't show him yet, Julian said, closing his notebook. We invite him here. We let him think he's coming to sign our surrender agreement. I looked at Julian. He's not going to walk into a trap easily. He will if he thinks he's winning, Julian replied. Tell him you're ready to take the $200,000 and walk away. Tell him to bring his brother and his corporate counsel to the studio on Monday at 2 p.m. to execute the deed transfer. I picked up the phone on the desk, dialed Dorian Wynn's Chicago number, and put it on speaker. Wynn, he answered on the second ring. It's Leo Hensley, I said, keeping my voice low and tired, like a man who had run out of options. I spoke with my attorney. We don't have the money to fight the lien in court. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of papers shuffling in a high-rise office. Smart decision, Leo, Dorian said, his tone smooth and entirely devoid of surprise. It's just business. You held out longer than most people would have. I have 2 conditions, I said. I want the $200,000 in cleared funds at signing, and I want Timothy here in person. I want him to look me in the eye when I hand over my uncle's keycard. Dorian let out a quiet, amused breath. Timothy is currently in Chicago, staying out of the spotlight. But if it makes you feel better about signing the papers, I can arrange for him to be there. Monday at 2? Monday at 2, I said, in the main tracking room. I hung up the phone. My hands were steady, but my heart was pounding against my ribs like a kick drum. Over the weekend, we didn't stop working. We didn't cancel any sessions. The indie band from Ypsilanti came back on Saturday to finish their mix. I sat behind the board, writing the faders, listening to their lead singer pour his heart into a broken microphone while Julian sat in the back corner of the room, typing up formal legal notices on a tablet. By Sunday night, the band had their finished master tracks saved to a flash drive. They stood in the alley outside the back door, hugging Clara and shaking my hand until my arm was sore. We don't know how to thank you, Leo, the singer said, holding the small plastic drive like it was made of solid gold. Nobody ever gave us a chance like this. Just make sure people hear it, I told him. That's all the thanks the building needs. I watched their rusted van pull away down the wet alley, its taillights reflecting red off the slick asphalt. On Monday morning at 1:30 p.m., the main tracking room was completely dark except for a single overhead lamp hanging above a long wooden trestle table we had dragged out from the back storage room. Julian was sitting at the table, his leather briefcase open beside him, 3 neat stacks of paper arranged in front of him. I stood near the mixing console, wearing my old canvas work jacket, holding a cold cup of black coffee. At 1:55 p.m., a large silver Mercedes SUV pulled into the alley behind the building. The back door opened, and 3 men walked in. First was Dorian Wynn. He was in his mid-40s, tall with sharp gray at the temples hair, wearing a dark navy wool coat that looked like it cost more than my truck. Behind him was a high-priced corporate lawyer holding a thin leather portfolio, and lagging behind them both, looking nervous and sullen, was Timothy Vance, Blaine. He was wearing an oversized designer jacket, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, refusing to look directly at me or Julian. It's cold in here, Leo, Dorian said, stepping into the dim light of the overhead lamp. He didn't offer his hand. He just unbuttoned his coat and looked around the high brick walls of the tracking room. You should have kept the heat on. The building knows when it's being sold, I said, setting my coffee cup down on the edge of the console. It drops the temperature. Dorian smiled thin, unamused. He motioned to his lawyer, who stepped forward and placed a thick legal binder on the wooden table in front of Julian. This is the master deed transfer and release of liability, the lawyer said in a flat, clinical voice. Upon signature by Mr. Hensley, a wire transfer of $200,000 will be initiated from our escrow account directly to the Silas Hensley Trust. Julian didn't touch the binder. He didn't even look down at it. Before we execute any transfer, Julian said, his voice quiet and completely steady, we need to clear up an accounting discrepancy regarding the cross-collateralized loans. Dorian frowned slightly, turning his head toward Julian. There's no discrepancy. The lien is certified by the county court. $3.2 million. You agreed to the terms on Friday. We agreed to meet, Julian corrected smoothly. He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a thick black binder, and set it down on the table with a dull, heavy thud. We didn't agree to sign. Dorian's eyes narrowed. What is this? This is a summary audit of the digital assets located on the external hard drive your brother left behind when he was removed from these premises, Julian said. At the mention of the hard drive, Timothy Vance froze, nose. His face went instantly pale under the overhead light. He took a half step back toward the hallway door. "Hold on, Timothy," Dorian said, his voice dropping an octave, his eyes fixed on his brother. "What hard drive?" "It's nothing, Dorian," Timothy stammered, his voice higher and faster than usual. "It's just old backup files from my personal sessions. They don't have anything to do with the property lease." "That's not entirely accurate, Timothy," Julian said. He opened the binder to the first tab. "On this drive are 74 unreleased vocal stems belonging to artists signed to Universal, Sony, and Warner Music Group. Tracks cut in facilities owned by your brother's subsidiaries over the last 3 years." Dorian looked at Julian, then slowly turned his head to look at his brother. "What is he talking about?" "He's lying," Timothy shouted, pointing a finger at Julian. "He's trying to stall. He doesn't have shit. Every stem on that drive contains metadata, proving it was illegally converted and offered for sale to third-party overseas production entities." Julian continued calmly, as if Timothy hadn't spoken at all. "The sales were routed through a private offshore account registered to Timothy C. Vance, however, because the hardware used to extract and process those tracks was registered to Winter Management LLC, the corporate entity holding primary legal liability for those statutory copyright violations is yours, Dorian." The room went dead silent. The only sound was the distant hum of the city traffic outside on Lafayette Avenue and the steady rhythm of the rain against the roof rafters. Dorian stared at his brother. His face didn't show anger. It showed a terrifying cold realization. "How much?" Dorian asked Julian, his voice barely above a whisper. "Federal statutory damages for willful copyright infringement carry a maximum penalty of $150,000 per violation," Julian said, with 74 confirmed stems. "Winter Management is looking at an immediate civil exposure of $11.1 million, and that's before the labels file criminal complaints for wire fraud." Dorian stepped closer to the table, leaning his hands on the wood, staring down at the binder pages Julian had opened. He looked at the serial numbers, the timestamps, the bank routing numbers listed on the audit sheets. He didn't say a word for 2 full minutes. Then he slowly raised his head, turned his body around, and looked at Timothy. "You idiot," Dorian said. The words came out flat, cold, and utterly devoid of emotion. "You absolute, incompetent idiot." "Dorian, listen to me," Timothy began, stepping forward with his hands raised. "Shut your mouth," Dorian commanded. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke with the quiet, crushing authority of a man who owned everything his younger brother had ever touched. "Shut your mouth and go sit in the car. Dorian, go to the car." Timothy now. Timothy looked at his brother, then at Dorian's lawyer, who was looking down at his own shoes, completely refusing to meet his eye. Timothy's mouth worked silently for a second. Then he turned on his heel, pushed open the heavy steel door, and walked out into the rain. The door slammed shut behind him with a heavy metallic bang. Dorian took a deep breath, pulled his navy coat tighter around his shoulders, and turned back to face me and Julian. "What do you want?" Dorian asked simply. "We want the $3.2 million lien extinguished immediately," Julian said, pulling a fresh document from his briefcase and sliding it across the wooden table. "We want a complete legal release of liability for the Silas Hensley Trust, signed by you and your corporate counsel right now. And we want Winter Management to assign all operating lease rights back to Leo Hensley in perpetuity." Dorian looked down at the document. "And the hard drive?" "The physical drive stays in my safe," I said, stepping forward from the console. "As long as that lien is discharged and you stay away from this building, those files stay in the dark. If anyone from your firm ever steps foot on Lafayette Avenue again, Julian walks that drive straight into the United States Attorney's office in Chicago." Dorian looked at me for a long time. His eyes were cold, calculating the numbers in his head. He wasn't thinking about legacy or music or acoustics. He was calculating $11.1 million in statutory damages against $3.2 million in bad debt on an old warehouse. He pulled a silver fountain pen from his coat pocket, unscrewed the cap with a precise, deliberate motion, and signed his name on the bottom line of Julian's document. He handed the pen to his lawyer, who signed beneath him without saying a word. Dorian picked up his leather gloves from the table, pulled them onto his hands, and looked up at the high ceiling of the tracking room one last time. "You're sitting on a pile of worthless brick, Leo," Dorian said softly. "This city is moving past places like this." "Maybe," I said, "but the brick is ours. Get out of my studio." Dorian turned and walked out the back door into the gray Detroit afternoon. His lawyer picked up his portfolio and followed him, closing the door quietly behind them. Julian picked up the signed release document, looked at the ink to make sure it was dry, and slid it neatly into his briefcase. He clicked the brass locks shut and looked at me over his glasses. "That's it," Julian said. "The building is clear. No liens, no leases, no corporate management, just you and the trust." I walked over to the main circuit breaker behind the SSL board and flipped the master switch. The high voltage power hummed back to life. The VU meters on the console flickered green and amber. The ambient warm lights in the control room bloomed to life, casting a golden glow over the old mahogany frame and the exposed brick walls. I walked out to the front entrance, unlocked the heavy glass doors, and pulled them wide open. By 3:30 p.m., the rain had stopped. A cold, clear winter sun was breaking through the gray clouds over Lafayette Avenue. A white pickup truck pulled up to the curb. Marcus Locke climbed out of the driver's side, wearing a heavy flannel jacket and a knit cap, carrying a box of replacement cables and a bag of hot donuts from the shop down the street. "Hey, Leo," Marcus called out, walking up the concrete steps. "Is the power back on?" "Power's on, Marcus," I said, holding the door for him as he stepped inside. "Let me go turn on the tape machine." I walked back to the control room, the smell of Marcus's cheap coffee and sugar glaze trailing behind me. I flipped the power switch on the Studer A827 tape machine. The heavy motors engaged with a satisfying, deep clunk, the reels spinning for a second before locking into tension. For the next 2 weeks, the studio felt exactly the way it was supposed to. The air was thick with the smell of warm tubes, hot coffee, and rosin from Clara's cello bow. The kids from Ypsilanti finished their ep, and when I handed them the master flash drive, the lead singer looked like he was holding a brick of solid gold. They paid me the $1,200 they had saved up, and I put it straight into the utility account to keep the lights on. Marcus brought in a local jazz trio he'd been playing with, and we tracked them live in the B room, chasing a raw, unpolished sound that made the playback speakers rattle in the best possible way. We were making music again. But making music and surviving aren't the same thing. The reality of taking back a 20,000 square foot warehouse hit me on a freezing Tuesday morning. I was sitting at the front desk, staring at a stack of mail that had piled up while Blaine was playing record executive. Julian had warned me. Taking back the deed was the clean part. The fallout was the mess. Blaine had stopped paying the local property taxes 3 months ago. He had diverted the escrow payments to fund his VIP lounge renovations. The city of Detroit didn't care about our internal trust disputes or illegal leases. They just cared that there was a $34,000 tax lien sitting on the property, and it was due in 14 days. I called Julian. "What about the $200,000 from Dorian Wynn?" I asked, looking at the red ink on the municipal notice. Julian let out a heavy sigh over the phone. It's tied up in a corporate audit. Dorian signed the release, and Winter Management initiated the transfer, but because the payment is part of a liability settlement exceeding 100 grand, their bank flagged it for a 60-day compliance hold. They're dragging their feet, Leo. It's a spite move. They know they lost the building, so they're going to make you sweat for the operating cash. I don't have 60 days, I said. The city gave us 2 weeks. I can file an extension based on the management transition, Julian offered, though he didn't sound confident. But that only buys us 30 days, and it comes with an 8% penalty fee. You need cash, Leo, real cash, right now. I hung up and looked at the bank ledger. The trust account had exactly $4,210 in it. It cost $3 grand a month just to heat the place. I spent the rest of the day in the control room, staring at the Cecil board, running the math in my head over and over. I could sell a couple of the vintage microphones. The Neumann U67s were worth 15 grand a piece to the right collector in Nashville or LA. But that was exactly what Blaine had done. If I started selling off Silas's gear just to pay the taxman, I wasn't saving the studio. I was just dismantling it slower than Blaine had. The next morning, it was sleeting, the kind of freezing sideways rain that makes the city look completely deserted. I was in the back hallway, trying to patch a leaky radiator valve with Teflon tape, when I heard the heavy glass front door pull open. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked out to the lobby. Standing on the welcome mat, shaking the ice off a long black wool coat, was Hester Quill. I hadn't seen Hester in almost a decade. She was a legend in the Detroit R&B scene, a manager and promoter who had pulled half a dozen platinum artists out of local clubs in the 90s. She was a small, sharp-eyed woman in her late 60s who didn't take an ounce of disrespect from anyone. Silas used to say Hester could negotiate a shark out of its teeth. She looked around the lobby, her eyes lingering on the empty spots where Blaine's expensive leather sofas used to be. I heard the parasite got evicted, Hester said, her voice raspy from 40 years of smoking. Word travels fast, I said, walking behind the reception desk. In this town, blood in the water always draws a crowd, she said. She walked over to the desk and set a heavy, scuffed leather briefcase on the counter. I also heard Dorian Wynn was behind it, which means you're probably sitting on a mountain of back-owed taxes and frozen accounts right now. I didn't answer. I just looked at her. Hester wasn't the kind of person you gave free information to. She popped the brass latches on the briefcase. Inside were neat stacks of banded $100 bills. 40,000, Hester said, turning the briefcase around so I could see it. Cash, cleared, no escrow, no banks, no corporate red tape. I looked at the money, then back up at her. What are you buying, Hester? I need the A room, she said. 4 weeks, total lockout. Nobody else comes in, nobody else uses the board. Just my artist, his engineer, and you maintaining the gear. The A room was our massive primary tracking space. Silas had built it with floating floors and 20-foot ceilings. It was the crown jewel of the Lafayette. Booking it for a month straight would usually run 60 grand, but right now, 40,000 in cash was the difference between keeping the building and losing it to the city. Who's the artist? I asked. Hester closed the briefcase. Caden Ives. I felt my jaw tighten. 5 years ago, Caden Ives was the biggest indie rock songwriter in the country. His second album went triple platinum. Then he went on tour, and the wheels came off entirely. He showed up to a stadium show in Austin completely out of his mind, threw a mic stand through a $50,000 lead video wall, and got into a fistfight with his own bass player on stage. The label dropped him, the booking agents blacklisted him, and he vanished. Rumors in the industry were that he was living in a motel in Nevada, drinking himself to death. No, I said. Absolutely not. Leo, I just spent a week scrubbing the corporate rot out of this place, Hester. I'm not replacing it with a human wrecking ball. He destroyed a studio in Atlanta 3 years ago. Smashed a vintage Teletronics compressor with a guitar because he didn't like the vocal mix. Silas's gear is irreplaceable. I'm not letting him near it. Hester leaned over the counter, her dark eyes locking onto mine. Caden is sober. He's been out of rehab for 8 months. He wrote a new record. A real record. Leo. Just acoustic guitar, a piano, and his voice. The major labels won't touch him because he's an insurance liability. I took him on because I heard the demos. Good for you, I said. Find another studio. There is no other studio that sounds like this one, she shot back. And there's no other owner in this city desperate enough to take a cash buyout to cover a tax lien by Friday. Silas told me once, you had a good ear, but a stubborn head. Don't let your pride cost you your uncle's legacy. She tapped her fingernail against the leather briefcase. 40,000. Leo, it pays your taxes. It buys you time until winter's escrow clears. You sit in the back, you keep the mics working, and you let him sing. If he breaks a single piece of gear, you keep the cash and throw us out. I looked at the briefcase. I looked at the red municipal notice sitting under my coffee mug on the desk. I hated the music industry. I hated how it always came down to choosing between bad options. If he smokes in the control room, you're out, I said, my voice hard. If he brings a drop of alcohol into this building, you're out. If he so much as looks at one of my microphones the wrong way, the lockout is over, and I keep every dime. Deal, Hester said without hesitating. She pushed the briefcase across the counter. He loads in tomorrow at noon. She turned and walked out into the sleet. I spent the rest of the day moving every piece of fragile vintage gear out of the A room. I locked the U47s and the old Urca ribbon mics in the heavy iron safe. I swapped out the primary monitors for a pair of rugged, heavy-duty Yamaha speakers that could take a beating. If Caden Ives was going to have a meltdown, he was going to do it in a padded room with gear I could afford to replace. On Thursday at exactly 12 p.m., a black car pulled up to the alley door. Hester got out first, followed by a young, nervous-looking guy carrying 2 Pelican cases of hard drives. I assumed he was the engineer. Then Caden Ives stepped out. He looked 10 years older than his press photos. He was thin, wearing a faded denim jacket, a gray beanie pulled down low over his ears, and dark sunglasses. He carried a battered Martin acoustic guitar case in one hand. He didn't look like a rock star. He looked like a ghost. I met them at the door. I didn't offer my hand. Rules are simple, I said, looking directly at Caden. No food or drink near the console. You treat the equipment with respect. You have an issue with the room, you talk to me. You don't touch the patch bay. Understood? Caden just stared at me through the dark lenses of his sunglasses for a moment. Then he gave a slight, slow nod and walked past me into the hallway, dragging his guitar case behind him. His engineer, a kid who introduced himself as Arlo, looked at me apologetically. He doesn't talk much before he sings. Sorry, man. I followed them into the A-room control booth. Arlo immediately started opening his Pelican cases, pulling out a laptop and a complicated array of digital interfaces. What's all this? I asked, leaning against the doorframe. Caden likes to track to his own digital grid, Arlo explained rapidly, unspooling a mass of USB cables. We bypass the analog board entirely. I'll just need to patch directly into your main wall outputs and take over the monitor routing. I felt a spike of irritation in my chest. You're bypassing an SSL 4000G console to run audio through a laptop? It's just how he works, Arlo said, not looking up as he started yanking cables out of the studio's carefully organized patch bay. I stepped forward and grabbed Arlo's wrist. I didn't squeeze hard, but I stopped him from pulling the next cable. You don't touch the patch bay, I repeated, my voice completely flat. Tell Tell me what outputs you need, and I will route them. If you start pulling blind, you're going to short the phantom power and blow out a channel strip. Arlo swallowed hard, pulling his hand back. Right, sorry, I need channels 1 through 4 direct out. I spent the next 20 minutes rerouting the room to accommodate Arlo's digital rig. It felt like an insult to the room. Silas hadn't spent 2 years floating concrete floors just so some kid could compress the life out of a vocal track using a cracked software plugin. But I kept my mouth shut. The $40,000 was sitting in the bank. The taxes were paid. I just had to survive 4 weeks. Caden set up in the center of the massive live room. It was a space designed for a 30-piece orchestra, and he was sitting on a single wooden stool in the exact middle of it, looking incredibly small. Can you kill the lights? Caden's voice came through the talkback monitors. It was the first time he had spoken. His voice was gravelly, dry. Which ones? Arlo asked into the mic. All of them, Caden said. I don't want to see the walls. I reached over and killed the main overheads, leaving only the dim glow of the exit signs and the small reading lamp attached to his music stand. For the next 3 hours, Caden played the same 4 chords on his acoustic guitar. He didn't sing a single word. He just picked the strings, stopped, sighed heavily into the microphone, adjusted his tuning peg, and started over. It was agonizing to watch. Arlo sat in the chair next to me, staring at his laptop screen, tapping his foot nervously. Is he going to track anything? I asked quietly. After the 50th time, Caden stopped mid-measure. He's finding the room, Arlo whispered defensively. You have to let him find the room. On the 4th day, the tension finally snapped. We had been sitting in the dark for 6 hours. Caden was trying to lay down a vocal for a slow, haunting ballad. He sounded terrible. His voice was thin, completely lacking the power that had made him famous. He was straining for notes he used to hit in his sleep. He stopped in the middle of a chorus, pulling the headphones off his ears and throwing them onto the wooden floor. They hit with a loud, plastic crack. I was out of my chair before Arlo could even react. I hit the heavy soundproof door, pushing it open, and strode out into the live room. Pick them up, I said, my voice echoing slightly in the massive space. Caden looked at me, his eyes bloodshot in the dim light. They're just headphones, man. Put it on my tab. I don't have a tab for you, I said, stopping 10 feet away from him. Pick up the headphones. You throw gear in my studio again, and you're packing your bags. Caden stood up from the stool. He wasn't a big guy, but he had the reckless, chaotic energy of a man who didn't care what happened to him. The mix is garbage, Caden spat, gesturing toward the control room window where Arlo was watching us. Terrified, the room sounds dead. I can't hear the resonance. It sounds like I'm singing in a cardboard box. The room sounds dead because you bypassed an analog preamp to run your vocal through a sterile digital interface, I fired back. You're suffocating the microphone. It's not the room. It's your engineer. Don't tell me how to make a record, Caden snarled, taking a step toward me. You're a glorified janitor who inherited a building. You don't know the first thing about what it takes to pull a song out of your own head. I stood perfectly still. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. I thought about throwing him out. I thought about walking over to the bank, withdrawing the remaining $30,000 of Hester's money, dumping it on the floor, and telling him to get out of my sight. But I looked at his hands. They were shaking. The anger wasn't directed at me. It was directed at himself. He knew he sounded bad, and he was terrified that whatever magic he used to have was gone for good. I didn't yell. I didn't step back. Give me 10 minutes, I said quietly. I turned around, walked back into the control room, and looked at Arlo. Save your session, I told the kid. Then pack up the laptop. What? Why? Arlo panicked. Is he firing me? No, I said, reaching over the console and grabbing the heavy patch cables Arlo had installed. I started yanking them out of the wall, but we're doing this my way. I dropped the braided cables onto the carpet. Arlo stared at me like I had just set his laptop on fire. You can't do that, Arlo stammered, his hands hovering over his keyboard. The routing map took me 2 hours to build. His vocal chain is choking him to death, I said, turning away from the kid and walking over to the heavy iron safe tucked under the producer's desk. I spun the dial, entered the combination, and pulled the heavy steel door open. Inside, resting in a custom velvet-lined wooden box, was one of Silas's original Neumann U47 microphones. It was heavy, silver, and 60 years old. I lifted it out with both hands, grabbed a vintage Mogami cable from the rack, and walked straight out into the live room. Caden was still standing by his stool, looking pissed and exhausted. What are you doing? He asked as I unscrewed his cheap dynamic mic from the stand and replaced it with the U47. I'm giving you a fighting chance, I said, plugging the heavy cable into the base of the mic and wrapping it once around the stand to relieve the tension. You're a singer, not a data file. You need air to push against. This microphone breathes. It hears everything. The good, the bad, the rasp, the cracking. It's going to strip you naked. Caden looked at the old German microphone, then back at me. I don't need to be stripped naked. I need to sound like a professional. No, you don't, I said, looking him dead in the eye. You came here because nobody else would touch you. You're broken, Caden. Your voice is shot from 5 years of liquor and screaming in stadiums. If you try to sound like the kid you were at 22, you're going to sound like a fake. Stop fighting it. Sing like a guy who lost everything and lived. He stared at me, his jaw tightening. For a second, I thought he was going to take a swing at me. I thought about the $40,000 in the bank and whether Hester was going to demand a refund when her artist walked out on day 4. Instead, Caden let out a slow, jagged breath, picked up his acoustic guitar, and sat back down on the stool. Turn off the lights, he said quietly. I walked back into the control room, killed the overheads, and sat down at the center of the SSL console. Arlo was standing awkwardly in the corner. I ignored him. I patched the U47 directly into channel 1, running it through a vintage Neve 1073 preamp and bypassing the digital interface entirely. I pushed the fader up just a fraction of an inch. The silence in the live room suddenly came alive. Through the massive Yamaha monitors, I could hear the microscopic details of the A room. I could hear the fabric of Caden's denim jacket shifting. I could hear the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. I could hear the faint, hollow hum of the acoustic guitar body resonating against his chest. I'm rolling tape, I said into the talkback mic. I hit the heavy metal record button on the Studer machine. The reels started spinning. Take your time. Caden started playing. It was the same 4 chords he had been wrestling with all afternoon, but this time, it sounded different. The analog gear didn't compress the life out of the instrument. It caught the heavy, warm resonance of the wood. Then, he leaned into the microphone and sang. It wasn't pretty. He didn't hit the high notes perfectly. His voice broke on the second line of the verse, a rough, gravelly crack that would have made a pop producer hit the stop button instantly. But I didn't stop. I rode the fader, giving him volume when he pulled back, catching the heavy transients when he pushed hard. He sang for 4 minutes straight. He didn't stop. He didn't curse. He just kept his eyes closed and let it bleed out. When the last chord rang out, hanging in the air for almost 10 seconds before fading into the natural silence of the room, I hit the stop button on the tape machine. Nobody said a word. Arlo was staring at the floor, completely still. Come in here, I said into the talkback. A minute later, the heavy door opened, and Caden walked into the control room. He slung his guitar onto the couch and stood behind my chair, crossing his arms. He looked defensive. Play it back, he said. I hit rewind, let the tape spool back to the beginning, and hit play. The sound filled the control room. It It was massive. It wasn't loud, but it had a physical weight to it. You could feel the sorrow in the vocal cord friction. It didn't sound like a radio hit. It sounded like a man sitting in a dark room, bleeding out on a wooden floor. When the track finished, Caden just stood there. He didn't move. He kept staring at the speakers, his eyes wide behind his sunglasses. Slowly, he reached up and pulled the sunglasses off, wiping a hand across his face. That's me? He whispered. That's you, I said. No digital tuning, no artificial reverb, just a U-47, a good preamp, and a great room. He looked down at the mixing board, then over at Arlo. Arlo, Caden said, his voice completely flat. Pack your laptop. You're done. Arlo blinked. Wait, Caden, man. I can adjust the plugins. I don't want plugins, Caden said. I want that. Pack your shit. Your flight back to LA is on Hester. Arlo didn't argue. He knew when he was beat. He quietly packed his Pelican cases, grabbed his coat, and walked out the door without another word. When it was just the two of us, Caden looked at me. How much to engineer the rest of the record? He asked. You already bought the room for a month, I said, leaning back in the leather chair. I come with it. For the next 2 weeks, we didn't see the sun. Caden and I fell into a grueling, obsessive rhythm. He would show up at 10 in the morning, drink 2 pots of black coffee, and sit in the live room until midnight. We tracked acoustic guitars, a beat-up upright piano I wheeled in from the hallway, and vocals. Just the two of us. No managers, no hangers-on, no record executives. The music was devastating. It was a 12-song apology letter to everyone he had ever hurt, written by a guy who finally understood he couldn't fix the damage. We didn't do more than 3 takes of any song. If he messed up a lyric, we kept it. If his voice cracked, we pushed it to the front of the mix. I was exhausted, my back aching from sitting at the board for 14 hours a day. But for the first time since my uncle died, I felt completely awake. The studio was doing exactly what it was built to do, but the real world doesn't care about a good vocal take. It was a Tuesday afternoon. We were in the middle of mixing track 7 when the heavy glass front door rattled violently. I ignored it. 10 seconds later, the buzzer rang. It was a harsh, electrical grating sound that bled right through the soundproof doors. Keep reviewing the stem, I told Caden, pulling my headphones off. I'll be right back. I walked down the long hallway to the front lobby. Standing on the other side of the glass was a man in a neon yellow high-visibility jacket, holding a clipboard and a heavy maglite flashlight. Parked at the curb behind him was a White City-issued Ford Explorer with the Detroit Department of Buildings and Safety Engineering logo on the door. My stomach did a slow, heavy roll. I unlocked the door and pulled it open. Can I help you? I asked, stepping into the doorway to block his view of the interior. Leo Hensley? The man asked. He looked to be in his 50s, with a gray mustache and a bored, bureaucratic expression. His ID badge read Stellan. That's me. I'm here for the follow-up inspection on the structural modification permits, Stellan said, clicking his pen and looking down at his clipboard. Permit number 4409B, commercial zoning alteration. There must be a mistake, I said, keeping my voice level. We haven't done any structural modifications to this building in 10 years. The only thing we did recently was pull out some cosmetic drywall in the B room. Stellan didn't look up. Cosmetic doesn't cover load-bearing steel, Mr. Hensley. 3 months ago, your management company filed an expedited request to remove 2 primary steel support columns in the east wing to install a free-spanning VIP lounge. They started the work before the city engineer approved the load calculations. Blaine, that arrogant, incompetent bastard, he hadn't just redecorated the B room. He had hired cheap, under-the-table contractors to tear out structural supports so he could fit a bigger bar into his lounge. The management company that requested those permits was evicted, I told Stellan, my pulse starting to hammer in my ears. They're gone. We took the property back. Doesn't matter who requested it, Stellan said, finally looking up at me. The work was done on this parcel. I need to see the east wing. I'm in the middle of a locked-out recording session right now, I said, putting a hand on the doorframe. You can't come in. Stellan's bored expression vanished, replaced by a cold, authoritative stare. I'm a city inspector, Miss Hensley. If you deny me entry to inspect an open structural permit, I go back to my truck, I call the fire marshal, and we chain these doors shut from the outside within the hour. Your choice. I stared at him for 3 seconds. Then I stepped aside. I led him down the hallway, past the A room where Caden was sitting, and took him to the back corridor that led to the B room. The space was mostly empty now, just the drum kits and the copper tape we had started rewiring. But Stellan didn't care about the instruments. He walked straight to the center of the room, looking up at the ceiling. He pointed his heavy maglite upward. The bright beam hit the exposed rafters, where 2 massive vertical steel I-beams used to connect the floor to the roof trusses. There was nothing but jagged, torched metal. Blaine's contractors had literally cut the columns out with acetylene torches and patched the ceiling with drywall to hide it. Jesus Christ, Stellan muttered, lowering the flashlight. The roof isn't sagging, I said quickly, though looking at it now, I could see a faint, terrifying bow in the wooden cross beams. The exterior brick is carrying the load. The exterior brick is carrying a load it wasn't engineered for, Stellan corrected, scribbling furiously on his clipboard. If we get a heavy snowpack this winter, this roof is coming down straight into this room. He ripped a heavy pink piece of carbon paper off his clipboard and handed it to me. What is this? I asked, looking at the bold red text at the top. It's a notice of condemnation, Stellan said flatly. The structural integrity of this building has been compromised. You are in violation of city code. How do I fix it? I asked, my voice tight. I'll put the columns back. I'll hire a welder tomorrow. You can't just put them back, Stellan said, walking toward the exit. You need a licensed structural engineer to draft new load calculations. You need city-approved steel contractors to install temporary shoring, and then you need to replace the columns to modern commercial code. Then I come back and inspect it. How much time do I have? Stellan stopped at the front door and looked back at me. 30 days. If the shoring isn't in place and the permits aren't cleared by the 26th of next month, the certificate of occupancy is permanently revoked. Water and power get shut off, and the building gets condemned for demolition. He pushed the door open and walked out into the cold afternoon. I stood in the lobby holding the pink slip of paper. I walked behind the reception desk and pulled up a browser on the old desktop computer. I searched for structural shoring contractors in Detroit. I called the first 3 numbers on the list, read them the violation code on the pink slip, and asked for a rough estimate over the phone. The cheapest quote was $75,000. The most expensive was $90,000, and they all needed half up front just to schedule the engineer. I had exactly $4,000 in the trust account. Hester's $40,000 had entirely gone to the city tax lien. I had 0 credit, no assets to borrow against, and a building that was one heavy snowstorm away from caving in on itself. I folded the pink slip, put it in my back pocket, and walked slowly back to the A room. When I opened the heavy soundproof door, Caden was sitting at the mixing console, looking at his phone. He looked up when I walked in. Everything all right? He asked. Yeah, I lied smoothly, sitting back down in my chair and grabbing the mouse. Just a meter reader. Let's run track 8 from the top. We worked until 2 a.m. Caden laid down the best acoustic track of the record, a driving, brutal song about driving through the desert out of his mind on painkillers. It was brilliant. It was going to put him back on the map, and it was going to remind the whole city what the Lafayette sounded like. When he finally packed up his guitar and left, I locked the front doors, turned turned off the lights and walked back to the control room. I pulled the pink condemnation notice out of my pocket and set it on the console, right next to the vintage Neve preamp. I was out of moves. Julian was tapped out fighting Dorian Wynn's corporate lawyers, who were still intentionally stalling the $200,000 settlement wire. Winter Management knew exactly what they were doing. They were bleeding me dry by inches. Dorian hadn't won the building, but Blaine had left enough landmines buried in the floorboards to ensure I'd lose it anyway. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was 2:30 in the morning. Nobody calls at 2:30 in the morning with good news. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was an unknown local number. I hit answer and held it to my ear. "Hello, Leo," a woman's voice said. It was crisp, professional, and completely awake. "My name is Imogen Wolf. I represent a private holdings group. I don't sell the building," I said automatically, assuming it was another vulture developer sniffing around the tax records. "Don't call this number again. I'm not calling about the building, Leo," Imogen said smoothly. "I'm calling about Timothy Vance's hard drive." I froze. The blood in my veins turned to ice water. Nobody knew about the drive except me, Julian, Dorian, and his lawyer. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice tight. "You do," Imogen replied. "And so do we." Timothy Vance sold 74 bootlegged vocal stems to overseas producers. Dorian Wynn thinks the problem is contained because he bought your silence. But my clients aren't Dorian Wynn, and they aren't real estate developers. My clients are the people who bought those stems from Timothy. I stood up from the console, staring at the locked iron safe beneath the desk. "What do you want?" I asked. "Timothy took our money, but he never delivered the final decryption keys for the master files before you locked him out of the studio," Imogen said. Her voice didn't carry a threat. It carried the calm certainty of a bank ledger. "Those files are sitting on the physical drive currently located in your building. My clients need their property. Those files belong to the record labels," I said. "They're stolen property. They belong to whoever holds them, Leo," she corrected gently. "I know you were issued a structural condemnation notice by the city at 3:15 p.m. today. I know you need roughly $80,000 to shore up the roof, and I know you don't have it." I stopped breathing. They had been watching the municipal records. They knew exactly how much leverage they had. "I will have a courier at your back door on Thursday at midnight," Imogen continued. "You will hand over the hard drive. The courier will hand you a cashier's check for $100,000, drawn on a clean, domestic shell account. It pays for your roof, it saves your uncle's legacy, and you never hear from us again. And if I say no," I asked, "then the city chains your doors shut in 30 days. The bank forecloses on the dirt, and we buy the hard drive at the liquidation auction for a fraction of the price." Imogen said. "We get what we want either way. The only question is whether you get to keep your studio." The line went dead. I lowered the phone and set it on the mixing console, right next to the pink condemnation notice. I stared at the screen for a long time. Imogen Wolf thought she had me backed into a corner. She thought she was the only one who knew how to play the leverage game. But she had just given me the one piece of information Dorian Wynn had been trying to keep from me for 2 weeks. The stems weren't just stolen. The sale hadn't been completed. If Imogen's clients didn't have the decryption keys, the bootlegged tracks were useless to them. But if I handed over the drive, the transaction would be finalized. The stolen property would officially cross international lines, completing a massive, multi-million-dollar wire fraud and copyright infringement operation. And the hardware metadata proving Winter Management facilitated the whole thing would go right along with it. Dorian wasn't stalling the $200,000 settlement because he was spiteful. He was stalling because he thought I didn't know the buyers were still actively trying to get the files. He was waiting for me to go bankrupt so he could buy the building at auction, take the drive, and bury the evidence before the overseas buyers could finish the transaction. I looked at the clock on the wall, 2:45 a.m. I picked up the phone and dialed Julian. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Leo, it's 3 in the morning," Julian groaned. "Is the building on fire?" "Wake up, Julian," I said. "I just got a call from a woman named Imogen Wolf. She represents the overseas producers who bought Timothy's bootlegged stems. They want the decryption keys on the drive. She offered me $100,000 in cash to hand it over on Thursday." I heard the rustle of sheets over the line as Julian sat up. The sleep was instantly gone from his voice. "She offered to buy the drive directly from you?" "Yes, which means the sale Timothy brokered was never finished. If I give them that drive, Winter Management is officially on the hook for completed international wire fraud. Dorian knows this. That's why he's starving me out. He needs the building back before I figure out how radioactive that drive really is." Julian let out a low whistle. "If those files unlock and hit the overseas market, Universal and Sony won't just sue Dorian for civil damages. They'll ask the feds to dismantle his entire holding company. Leo, this isn't just leverage anymore. This is a loaded gun pointed directly at Dorian's head." "I know," I said, "and the city just gave me 30 days before they condemn the building because of the structural damage Blaine left in the B room. I need $80,000 for a shoring engineer by Friday, or we lose the occupancy certificate." "Hang up," Julian said, his lawyer brain shifting into overdrive. "Don't talk to Imogen Wolf again. I'm calling Dorian right now." "It's 3 in the morning," I reminded him. "Dorian Wynn is about to have a very bad night," Julian replied. I hung up the phone. I walked over to the iron safe, spun the dial, and pulled out the black metallic hard drive. I set it on the console next to the Neve preamp. It looked so small, just a piece of plastic and metal, holding enough corporate venom to bring down a Chicago real estate empire. At 3:40 a.m., my phone rang again. It was Julian. I put it on speaker. "I have Dorian on a conference line," Julian said, his voice completely devoid of any grogginess. "He's listening." "Say hello, Dorian. You're playing a very dangerous game, Leo." Dorian's voice came through the speaker. He didn't sound smooth or amused anymore. He sounded exhausted and cornered. "I'm not playing a game at all, Dorian," I said, looking at the drive. "Imogen Wolf called me an hour ago. She offered me $100,000 for your brother's decryption keys. She's sending a courier on Thursday. I'm thinking about taking the money." There was a heavy silence on the line. I could hear Dorian breathing. "If you hand over that drive," Dorian finally said, his voice tight, "you're making yourself an accessory to the sale of stolen intellectual property." "No," Julian cut in sharply. "Leo is an unwitting property owner, returning an abandoned hard drive to a claiming party. The metadata on the drive, however, clearly shows that Winter Management hardware was used to extract the stems. If those files unlock, my first call is to the legal department at Warner Music Group to let them know exactly which real estate firm facilitated the theft of their master recordings." "What do you want?" Dorian asked. It was the same question he had asked in the tracking room 2 weeks ago, but this time, he didn't have a corporate lawyer standing behind him, and he wasn't offering terms. "I want the $200,000 you owe the trust," I said. "I want it wire transferred into the Silas Hensley Trust account by 9 p.m. this morning. Not 60 days, not held in compliance. Cleared, available cash. Furthermore, I want an additional $90,000 wired as a direct structural remediation penalty for the damage your brother did to my roof. $290,000 in 6 hours is impossible." Dorian snapped. "The banks aren't even open. You're a commercial developer, Dorian," Julian said. "You have access to immediate liquidity lines. Make the calls. If the money isn't in Leo's account by 9:01 a.m., he takes Imogen's meeting, hands over the drive, and Winter Management management gets indicted by the end of the fiscal year. And the drive? Dorian asked, his voice dripping with venom. Once the money clears, I take the drive out to the alley and put a drill press through the platters, I said. You get a video of it being destroyed. The stems stay locked forever. The overseas buyers get nothing. You walk away clean. Dorian didn't say anything for a long time. I could hear the faint sound of a siren passing outside his window in Chicago. 9 a.m., Dorian said, and hung up. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 6 months. I sank back into the leather chair and looked up at the ceiling. The faint bow in the wood didn't look quite so terrifying anymore. He'll pay it, Julian said over the speakerphone, a rare note of genuine satisfaction in his voice. He has to. Go get some sleep, Leo. I can't, I said, looking at the tape machine. Caden is coming back at noon. We have 4 more tracks to mix. At 8:55 a.m., I was sitting at the front reception desk, drinking a cup of stale coffee and staring at the banking portal on the old desktop computer. The trust account balance still read $4,210. Outside, the city was waking up. Delivery trucks were rumbling down Lafayette Avenue, splashing through the freezing slush. I clicked refresh on the browser. Still $4,210. I watched the digital clock in the corner of the screen. 8:58, 8:59. I clicked refresh one more time. The page loaded. The balance updated. $294,210. I stared at the numbers. I didn't cheer. I didn't pump my fist. I just let my head drop into my hands and closed my eyes, listening to the quiet hum of the building's radiators. We were safe. The Lafayette was safe. I spent the next hour making phone calls. I called the structural engineering firm that had quoted me $90,000. I told them I had the cash in hand and I needed a shoring crew on site by tomorrow morning. I called Stellan at the city inspector's office, left him a voicemail with the permit request numbers, and told him the structural remediation was fully funded and underway. Then, I walked back to the control room, took the black hard drive out of the safe, and carried it out to the back alley. The cold air hit me like a slap. I set the drive down on the concrete loading dock. I went back inside, grabbed a heavy DeWalt power drill from the utility closet, and clamped a half-inch titanium bit into the chuck. I propped my phone up against a brick to record the video. I put the tip of the drill bit dead center on the hard drive casing, pulled the trigger, and leaned into it. The bit chewed through the plastic and aluminum with a high-pitched scream. I drilled straight through the drive, pulling up ribbons of metal and shattered circuit board. I drilled 3 more holes through the platters, completely destroying any chance of the data ever being recovered. I stopped the recording, attached the video file to an email, and sent it to Julian so he could forward it to Dorian. Then I threw the shredded drive into the dumpster and walked back inside. At noon, Caden walked through the front doors. He looked exhausted, but there was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there when he first arrived. He was carrying 2 large coffees from the good shop 3 blocks over. Morning, Leo, he said, handing me one of the cups. You look like hell. Did you sleep at all? Not a wink, I said, taking a sip of the coffee. It was hot and black, but the roof isn't going to cave in, and the taxes are paid. Caden nodded slowly, looking around the lobby. Good, this place shouldn't be anything else but what it is. He walked down the hallway toward the A room. I stood at the desk for a moment, listening to his footsteps echo on the hardwood. I looked at the spot where Blaine's expensive leather couch used to be, and where the velvet ropes for the VIP lounge had been stacked. It was all gone. There was nothing left but exposed brick, thick soundproofing foam, and the smell of old wood. I walked back to the control room, sat down at the Cecil board, and flipped the power switch on the tape machine. The heavy motors engaged with that familiar, satisfying clunk, the reels spinning for a second before locking into tension. I leaned forward, hit the talkback mic, and looked through the glass. All right, Caden, I said. Let's make a record.